It's one thing to say to an employee, I'm sorry for what you're going through, or I understand it's challenging. It's another thing for that employee really to believe that you feel what they're feeling. Yeah. And leading with empathy, I think, is the most important thing today.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to Framework Leadership, a podcast about principles and ideas you can use today to take your leadership to the next level. I'm your host, Kent Ingle, president of Southeastern University.
And I'm your co-host, Michael Steiner, vice president of innovation.
And we're excited today to introduce our guest for the show, Pat D'Amico. Pat is a certified executive coach from UC Berkeley Executive Education and the Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute. So great to have you with us, Pat.
Thanks, Kent. Great to see you, Michael. Good to see you as well.
Now, Pat, your journey is quite unique, starting with your enlistment in the U.S. Army at age 17, serving the globe, then working over 25 years in the corporate world. Tell us a little bit more about your personal leadership journey and how it's kind of shaped your life.
So actually, I joined the Army at 17, and that was primarily because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I didn't have great grades in high school. So let's get that out of the way. It was really my time initially in the military, and then I ended up going to Valley Forge Military Academy for my commission. So it was during that time period that I really just became very engaged with this idea of leadership and leadership development and developing other leaders. It was really my forte, and I discovered that it was something I was extremely passionate about. And I think it's really guided my career. So when I spent a few years in the military, most of it overseas in deployments, and developed a lot of my leadership skill there. And then when I entered the private sector, which actually it's been 30 years now since I've been in the private sector, I've really kept that passion and really focused primarily on leadership and leadership development.
Love it. Love it. Love it. And so what are some of the things that you've learned from the military that's helped you be successful in some of these corporate environments?
Well, I think in the military, you're thrown into things, right? Very different than the corporate sector, where you sort of have to prove yourself before you're in a leadership position. The military is all about individual responsibility and individual leadership. So very early on, I began to learn lessons that I frankly have carried with me throughout my entire career. Some of which I often share this. When I was 17 and I started at Valley Forge Military Academy after basic training. I had this old sergeant major who he was a Vietnam vet, and we all idolized him. But he taught me the three primary, most important leadership lessons that I learned in my life. The two are fairly simple. The third one more complex. The first is don't mess with people's pay. Now, of course, he didn't use the word mess. It was the old Army. But he said, if somebody has a pay problem, fix it yesterday. Yeah. The notion being that people work, to support their families, support their lifestyle. So when somebody's got a pay problem, you really need to get on that. The second one, which I've really used a lot in the corporate sector, was don't mess with people's off time. And this is a really interesting concept in that when people are off, you need to let them be off as a leader, right? Make sure that when somebody's going on vacation or going on PTO, that you make sure they're aware, hey, look, take the time off. We'll have people covering for you. The biggest challenge that I found with this concept, though, in the private sector, in the corporate sector, is that leaders often don't set the right example in that area. So if I'm a leader and I tell folks, hey, look, when you're off, I'm not going to bother you, I'm not going to call you. But then when I go on vacation or PTO, I tell my team, hey, look, I'm going to be on vacation, but I'm reachable. If you need something from me, it really sort of doesn't jive with what you're telling your people, right? Yeah. It creates this sort of, expectation of, hey, when I'm off, I'm not really off. And therefore your employees start to think, well, am I really off when they're telling me I am? So I really try to impress on leaders, you need to set an example in that area.
Love it.
And then,
keep going. No, number three. I'm excited for number three.
And then the third one is, to me, the most important leadership lesson I ever learned. And that is that if your people truly believe you're looking out for their best interests, they will perform for you. But that concern and looking out for the best interest needs to be genuine, right? I've seen leaders that claim that don't really believe it. But at the end of the day, that is really the most profound leadership lesson I ever learned, and I've tried to live up to it, ever since I became a leader.
And we've talked to a lot of leaders on this show who have had incredible experiences with the Army. They've learned a lot. They've grown a lot. A lot of people owe their careers and what they've been able to do either to the Army, all that kind of stuff. And yet we're seeing like all-time lows in enlistment, right? It's kind of one of the headlines that goes across the board. And it's not just Army. It's also higher education, all that kind of stuff. Just as you're working with leaders, why do you think that is? And what do you think employers need to be doing and thinking differently for this next generation that's coming up as they're trying to evaluate, man, what's the path to start my life?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the one thing that research has showed us that's changed in this area is one thing that's really important. So post the Industrial Revolution, the number one reason people have left jobs has always been their manager, right? During the Industrial Revolution, and I had grandparents who worked at Bethlehem Steel. So, they would say, hey, the reason people left jobs was because of our personal safety, right? People would die on the job. But post the Industrial Revolution, the number one reason people leave jobs is always their manager. So number one, I think it's understanding that managers need to be competent. Yeah. And I see this as a huge gap. Yep. In the private sector, where there's an assumption if I hire somebody who's led before, they know how to lead. That is an incorrect assumption the majority of the time, because the reality is that leadership and management development really lacks significantly in the corporate sector. Very few, and I work with big name brand organizations that you would know, and I'm always blown away by how little they invest both time and money into leadership and management development. So there's got to be a level of competence for your leaders so that they know how to encourage, motivate, and keep people. So I think that's element number one. Element number two, though, is a big change. And that is that the number two reason people leave jobs was never even on the radar until probably about 5 years ago. And the number two reason people are leaving jobs now is a lack of development themselves. So the organizations are not developing them. So this new generation of employees have a desire to be in roles and be more importantly, with organizations that have a focus on developing them. And I think there's a common misconception when I share that piece of information with organizations. A lot of times I hear folks say, well, that's because the new generation of folks want to be promoted too quickly. And that may be true in itself, but it's not related to this. The truth is that folks want to know the organization is going to invest in my development, to potentially get me promoted or just make me better at what I'm doing. And so that's a big change. Yeah. I mean, years ago when I was working at J&J and running recruiting for J&J, to be frank, if a candidate had said to me during the interview, what are you going to do to develop me? I probably would have laughed and said, nothing. You should just be happy you're sitting here, right? The job market was different then. Right. But today, it's a major focus that organizations need to be aware of.
I love it.
Yeah, that's great. Coaching the leaders of top companies has to be sometimes a unique challenge. What does it take to be in this sort of position? And what are some of the common challenges you typically help your clients overcome throughout leadership, their leadership role?
Well, Ken, on that one, one thing about executive coaching is it's actually very tedious and it's very demanding from a coach's standpoint, right? So I really try to limit the amount of executives that I'm coaching at one time because I don't want to get people confused as to what they're dealing with. I think the two things I would mention first is I'm very often coaching leaders who are moving from like a senior director role to a VP role or a VP role to a C-suite role. And that transition requires them to stop thinking tactically 100% of the time and to think strategically. So one of the challenges I have is a lot of the folks I'm coaching when I start, they're coming out of roles where most of their time is focused on the tactics of moving the business forward. And now they find themselves in a role where it's more about what's the strategy of how to move the business forward. And what folks struggle with is when you're primarily managing tactics, it's one thing to the next. It's a continuous, nonstop, progression. When you have to think tactically, leaders need to learn to stop, clear their mind, and spend time quietly thinking about strategies that they can enact. And that's difficult because they're used to just moving from one fire drill to another. So the biggest challenge is getting folks into that strategic mindset of leave all your to-do list behind, look at the business strategically and look at what can be done. So that's probably number one. Number two is, as an executive coach, I spend probably equal amount of time with each coachee talking about their work lives and personal lives. What I find is it becomes a lot more about mindset at the suite level. So when they have things going on with them that they know are impacting things in their personal life that are impacting their work lives, we need to sort of talk through that. We need to tease that and say, okay, how is this impacting you on a day-to-day basis? What is occupying your thoughts and how is this interfering? And sometimes we go down paths of, discussing, hey, you've got to fix this issue you have going on at home, right? You're never going to get anywhere without addressing this. And what you're doing is you're putting it aside and focusing on your work as opposed to really addressing it.
I love it. I love it. And so, so much of that kind of executive coaching is going back, right? Like you said, is backfilling. What should you have done? What should you have got there? So if you were talking to, a early career person who's got their eye on the C-suite, got their eye on the executive one way, what's one thing they could be doing, thinking about, implementing into their lives to prepare themselves so that they don't have to backfill when they get there? What would you say that is?
Well, one is understanding the market, right? Understanding your business and understanding the market you're in. There's nothing that can replace sort of that knowledge, and there's never too much knowledge you can have about your space, your business, the market you're in, the customers, the challenges, all of those things. And along with that, I think I would say, and this is more sort of a total career standpoint, I was really fortunate that I've had somewhat of a non-traditional career. I've worked in a lot of different functions. And that was because I had a leader very early in my career in the private sector that said to me, hey, look, here's your role. Here's what your expectations are. But if there's anything else beyond that you want to be involved in, just let me know. And I overly took advantage of that. So I looked and I said, okay, I don't have any finance experience. So I looked for some finance projects within the organization, and I went to the president and said, hey, look, I'd like to be on this team, or I'd like to be involved with this. I need to kind of round out. I don't know a lot about that area. Operations and manufacturing, that's not my background, but I wanted to understand it. So I built my career and created a situation where I can speak intelligently about most of the functions within an organization. And I think that's been one of the greatest gifts that I was given by that person, because it sort of turned me on to, hey, I really need to explore other areas so I can speak intelligently about them. So I think that's the other thing is, don't get, we have to be myopically focused to an extent on what's our job, what's our role, what are our responsibilities, but being open and willing to talk to others, right, outside of our immediate function to try to understand what their goals are. It's sort of like building relationships within an organization. I always say to folks, you don't want the first time you go to somebody outside of your function to be when you need something from them. Create those relationships, meet those folks, spend time with them, understand, the key question of what's important to you, what are you looking to accomplish, and what are your primary objectives? Because that gives you some insight into, okay, now when I come to this individual for something, I'm looking to make a connection is how does what I need from them help them do their role or achieve their objectives.
Oh, that's great. We've got a couple more questions before we move into our fire round. As you mentioned earlier, part of your career was working with Johnson & Johnson, helping them with leadership development and recruitment. What were some of the biggest challenges you had to overcome when finding, talented employees and leaders for the company?
Yeah, so I ran recruiting for sales for all of J&J for the U.S., and I also ran the sourcing group that sourced candidates for all other functions. And what's been interesting is the job market really ebbs and flows, right? I was seeking a job myself at a time that was really challenging and really competitive. I was running recruiting at a time where it was a candidates market. So I think some of the challenges around finding folks is you're looking for not only the right experience, but today more than ever before, you're looking to see, does the individual align to the culture and the values of the organization. And that is absolutely a two-way street. And sometimes I have to make sure organizations know that. I mean, at the same time, you're looking for somebody that meets your values, your core values. That candidate's also looking for an organization that meets their core values. That is something we did not see 20, 30 years ago. We did not see individual candidates out in the market evaluating, hey, is this the right organization for me and my values? But we see it a lot now. And I think we're seeing some successes and failures, right? We're seeing some testing of, hey, we think our new employees want beanbag chairs, and they want, quiet rooms. They want, and to an extent, sometimes we're discovering that doesn't really satisfy the true motivation of that individual. Is it a work-life balance? Bigger issue. Is it the development that they're looking for? Do their core values really align to what they know to be important to them? So I think that's really changed a lot, where I'm spending a lot more time with organizations talking about, first, let's identify what are the core values of this organization. And then how do we identify for ourselves and for the candidate that that's going to work for them, that they're going to thrive in that environment.
I love it. I love it. What's when you're working with your employers and the executives, what's something that makes a candidate stand out immediately? Like the minute they have this or they do this or they go that, what's that secret sauce that puts them to the top of the pile as people are thinking about that?
After, obviously, the experience, I think it really comes down to how jazzed is that individual during the process, right?
Yeah.
There is no substitute for energy in an interview process.
Right.
And there's tons of data on this. And, even when I work with sales folks, I say, don't ever underestimate how your belief in your solution resonates with your customer. It's the same when you're interviewing. The energy you bring, how excited you seem to be there and to be part of the organization, there's just no replacement for that.
Yeah, that's so good. As we move into our fire round, just want to ask you 3 quick questions surrounding everything we discussed. Always love to get some quick, few practical, applicable pieces of advice. So, Michael, give the first one.
Love it. What's the most important leadership characteristic for leading in today's society?
Empathy, without a question.
Got it.
The reality is that it's one thing to say to an employee, I'm sorry for what you're going through, or I understand it's challenging. It's another thing for that employee really to believe that you feel what they're feeling. And leading with empathy, I think, is the most important thing today.
How can young leaders avoid being workaholics and achieving more holistic health in their life?
Oh, wow. I may not be the right person to answer that question. I've come to, it's funny because I guess sometime in probably my early 40s, I sort of stepped back and said, I've achieved a level of success that I'm proud enough of myself to sort of be able to create that balance. I think that, I'll even go back. I ended up in the hospital when I was in the Army, and my commander came in and he said, you're dehydrated, you're overworked, and the reality is your body is a piece of United States property, and if you mistreat it, it's going to be a problem. And I kind of thought about that, and I'm like, okay, there's some truth to that, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I think that folks need to understand that downtime, that time away from work is really, really critical for your mindset. You cannot be effective if work is all you do and work is all you think about. And I've lived through that, for years I lived through that without understanding that. And I think it's a lesson that would have been better learned earlier.
Right. I love it. Last question for us. What's the most common piece of advice you're giving to leaders across the board? You find yourself repeating this over and over, no matter the context, industry, where you're going. What's that kind of common, hey, all leaders really need to get this idea?
You've got to coach your people. You've got to coach. As leaders, your success is predicated on the success of the individuals in your charge. You cannot do it all alone, and you cannot be successful alone. But in order for your people to be successful, you've got to spend the time needed observing them, and more importantly, be willing to give them feedback, both positive and developmental. I think the biggest challenge, without a doubt, that I see is leaders lack of willingness or discomfort with giving their employees developmental feedback. But let's be honest, if you're not giving them developmental feedback, they're not able to get better. They don't know what can be improved. So you've got to coach. You got to coach your people.
Outstanding. Well, Pat, we want to thank you for joining us today on Framework Leadership. Grateful insights on doing leadership well, and just great to have you on the show.
Well, Kent, Michael, thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here, gentlemen.
Yeah, if you want to stay up to date with Pat, you can follow him on LinkedIn at Pat J. D'Amico. Is there any other area, Instagram? Are you on Instagram? Any other place we can point people?
No, really not. Primarily, everything for me is on LinkedIn, so that's the best way to connect with me.
Excellent, and I would encourage everybody to do so. Thanks again for being on the show, and thanks everybody for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of the week.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Framework Leadership. If you're watching on YouTube right now would be a great time to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button so you can get more leadership content right into your YouTube feed. You can also check us out on Instagram at Kent_Ingle, at Dr. Michael Steiner, or on Twitter and YouTube at Kent Ingle. And hey, if you love great email newsletters, and I know that I do, you want to check out the Framework Leadership newsletter. Every single Friday drops in great tips to be a better leader, resources, thoughts right into your inbox. Check it out. You can sign up at kentingle.com. Make sure you hop onto there. Thank you so much for listening to Framework Leadership.
Take care, everybody.